Grab a brew, listen up, and get back to you. This is Things I Wish I'd Known podcast.
Hello and welcome to Things I Wish I'd Known with your host, Rachael Welford. This is the podcast where we help you change your life through positive conversations. And I'm super excited today to be here with Anna Schaffner. And Anna is a coach, she is a writer, she is a researcher and a professor of cultural history at the University of Kent. And she's written a number of books on exhaustion and self-improvement, and she's just an all-round super interesting woman. I'm very excited to introduce her to you. And we've got lots of things that we agree on and some of the things maybe we don't agree on, which makes for an interesting conversation and big learnings. She has had her writing appear in multiple different pieces of press, things like The Guardian, Psychology Today, in the Psych. So you know that she is super, super knowledgeable. She knows what she's talking about. And I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. So thank you so much for coming, Anna. It's great to chat to you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel. I really look forward to our conversation.
Me too. We were, for anyone that's listening, we were having a chat basically that wasn't recorded about a different project that we also might be working on together. And I was like, why didn't we record this chat? You need to get on the podcast. And this happens to me a lot. I'll be just having these informal chats with people and I just think, oh my God, we need to record that. We need to get you on the pod. So thank you so much for being here. I mean, I love to start always with kind of how did you get into this? Because it's quite interesting, cultural history and then self-improvement and then exhaustion. Like, how do all those things link together and how did you get to where you are?
Yeah, great question. So I think I because I felt really exhausted a lot myself for quite a long time. I think I've sort of slipped in and out of burnout-like states, and often just felt really, really tired and energyless and kind of like very weighed down, and as though a great heaviness were kind of on my shoulders. And so I became interested in the topic of exhaustion, first from an academic point of view, but there's always, deeper reason for why we research things, and I think usually we kind of teach what we need to learn ourselves. But I became really interested in the topic of exhaustion. Because everyone was saying that ours is the most exhausting age in history. We've never had such complex, straining, draining times before. And there was a lot of news about burnout in the papers, and, like you couldn't switch on the radio and the television without hearing anything about burnout and how, social media have made us all basically incredibly tired and stretched and drained. And then I wondered whether we really do live in the most exhausting age in history, and I became really interested in whether other people in different periods of history have also felt tired and burned out. And then I started to research that topic, and I found, that actually exhaustion is a topic that has preoccupied everyone, going all the way back to ancient China and the ancient Greeks. Everyone has worried about their energies and the fact that energy is a limited resource.
Right.
And everyone, in every age, people have talked about how they can preserve their energy, how they can, take good care of it. And they have developed different theories about what drains us, And there's always a really interesting kind of culturally critical dimension to what we project our fears on, like what is deemed to drain us changes through history. Nowadays we blame it on new technology, on social media in particular, on neoliberal competitive capitalism and so on. But in the past, people blamed their exhaustion on very different things. So it's really interesting to look at those different stories we tell about exhaustion.
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to kind of simplify it too much, in my mind, where my brain's going with it is like, I think it's probably slightly more exhausting to be like ploughing fields all day, like manually, than it is to be like, oh no, I had to log on to Zoom and type a few emails and now I'm going to relax with Netflix and go on my phone, But it's a different type of exhaustion, isn't it? One is the kind of more physical you know, that you're having to physically do a lot more. Whereas I think now that after the industrial age, not that I know loads about this, but, you know, I imagine things have got easier since we've moved from, I don't know, doing things manually, horse and cart, that kind of thing, into having vehicles, having homes that are heated, having, you know, all these different technologies that actually a lot of the time can save us energy in terms of physical you know, exertion, but maybe they're using a lot more mental capacity that you don't, that I think sometimes we don't always think about that as like burning energy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's how I guess sometimes you can feel exhausted after a day. Like I know if I'm sometimes doing, you know, a lot of writing, if I'm writing blog posts or doing lots of different when I used to do my daily, and for those that used to get the daily dopamine download, don't worry, it is coming back as my energy levels improve. I've had long COVID, so I've cut back loads of stuff like recording the podcast and writing, but sometimes if I was just writing or recording all day, and they're things that I get loads of joy out of, you know, but sometimes at the end of the day you'd be like, whoa, I haven't moved. I've been at my laptop like, you know, fully in it, loving it, having a great time writing whatever I'm writing, and or just chatting to people like on the podcast, and then suddenly you're like, woof, it's really tiring, but I haven't physically like really done that much, you know, like number of steps or going to the gym or anything like that.
Yeah.
I guess what would be helpful for people to know is through your research and everything, is it the most exhausting time in history, or is it just different?
Yeah, I think, you know, what you just described, Rachel, is very spot on. You know, I think we have very
I'm taking your job.
No, it's true. It's, you know, very much that. I think we have more physical comfort in our lives, you know, generally speaking. We work less long hours. We have lots of technologies that have massively improved our physical life. But I think those technologies that have, you know, basically given us lots of time, or were supposed to give us lots of time, you know, by speeding up communication, by facilitating lots of things, you know, like using a dishwasher as opposed to washing your laundry by hand. Using a washing machine as opposed to washing your laundry by hand, and all these kind of devices. They were supposed to save us time, but they have also generated new stressors, you know. So whilst email speeds up communication, it has also become a really big stressor in our new life, you know, with overflowing inboxes, being constantly reachable, not managing that traffic, you know. Kind of dealing with email is now a huge part of many people's jobs, you know, and takes time away from doing the actual job we're meant to do. So I think with a lot of those new technologies have come new psychosocial stressors. And what you described, you know, that brain work can be really draining, and also connectivity can be really draining. Being reachable all the time can be really draining. And I think, you know, in our times, we also have, I would say, not a lot of hope for a more optimistic future, you know, because things have, I think the general zeitgeist always impacts on our mood and our energy levels. And there are periods in history that have been more optimistic, you know, where people were looking forward to a brighter, better future and still believed in progress and technology is our savior. And I think we live in a pretty gloomy period for various reasons, and climate change, you know, being perhaps the most, so surely the most horrific threat that is sort of looming over us. So I would say there are stressors now in our lives that other people haven't had to deal with. But people in other periods had to deal with other stressors, you know, like in the Cold War period, people were genuinely worried about being wiped out, you know, like the nuclear forces actually pressing the buttons. That was also a great mental worry. And then, you know, in periods of actual physical warfare, you know, where people really, really genuinely suffered, worried about their lives. I think we've moved on from, I think, physical stressors to more psychological stressors. And we can say that's, on the one hand, that's progress. On the other hand, you know, psychological suffering is also real. And it's very damaging. And it's not necessarily, to be preferred to physical hardship in lots of situations. So I think there have been trade-offs, and there are pluses and minuses in our situation. I think people talk a lot more about exhaustion and burnout. And I think another reason why burnout is such a big topic is because we just over-identify with our work. Work has become such a big topic for suffering. I think a lot of people genuinely suffer at work, and they really identify with their work and attach their value to their work. And, work is sort of tangled up with purpose, meaning, status, even the hope for kind of spiritual salvation in lots of cases. So work is really over-determined. And that's why I think a lot of people genuinely suffer at work because of this entanglement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's, I don't know, one of the schools of teaching that I follow, especially when I'm working one-to-one with clients, is there's this amazing book by a woman called Yvette Rose, and it's called The Body's Talking, Are You Listening? And it's essentially talking about, or what she teaches within that is that every single ailment that we have, whether that's burnout, exhaustion, whether it's cancer, whether it's, literally anything you can think of, tennis elbow, dislocated kneecaps, broken legs, right? Anything that you might think is an accident, generally they're not accidents. There's 4 different layers to every potential ailment. And one of those layers is the physical, and that's often where the symptoms will manifest. So like with burnout, for example. But then you've got the emotional component, the mental component, and the energetic or spiritual component. And it's very, very interesting when you look at that. I've literally looked up when I got that book, I looked up everything that's ever been wrong with me ever in my life, and was like, oh my God, what are all the meanings? And it's very, very interesting to see that I think there was maybe like one thing that I looked up that I thought, that doesn't resonate so much. But pretty much everything else, I was like, that's exactly what was happening in my life, like mentally and emotionally. I guess what might be helpful for people is how would you define burnout? Because I agree with you. I think a lot of people are talking about mental health and burnout and stuff like that now, which I think is incredible. Because when I first started shouting about this stuff back in 2017, I think it was 2018, not many people really knew the language that we now use around anxiety, depression, mental health, emotional well-being. People are talking about burnout. There's all these buzzwords around like narcissists and, all these different things. But what I worry about a little bit is that we are sometimes pathologizing what's just normal life. Like, if you haven't properly rested for years, you're going to feel exhausted, because we think resting is just scrolling on our phone or watching something on Netflix. But how often do you genuinely, unplug and you're just resting, peaceful, So how would you define burnout?
Yeah, great. I mean, you mentioned lots of really important points, and resting and the art of resting well is definitely one of them. So, I mean, I understand. I don't like burnout being applied in a really loose way to everyone who feels a little bit tired.
Yeah.
I mean, burnout is actually a really serious diagnosis. I mean, burnout, the burned out clients with whom I work, some of them just can't work, they have to quit their jobs, and it can be a really tragic condition, because they have worked really hard all their lives to progress in their careers, and suddenly, their bodies say no, and they can't concentrate, they can't focus, they cannot be productive anymore. And that's
exactly my story.
Really very, very, you mentioned that, and it's a terrifying state to be in. It's also, of course, a moment for exploration, and there is every crisis can be a learning opportunity if you handle it in a certain way. But I think burnout is real burnout is very, very serious. It's when we when we can't function anymore. When the body literally says no, and you cannot, you just cannot work. You can't. I mean, there are some differences between burnout and depression, in that burnout affects your ability to work and perform at work, and you can still function in other areas of your life, but really burned out cases often don't function in any area of their life, right? And there is, I mean, I would say burnout is when you're chronically exhausted, when you feel very cynical and hopeless about your work and your abilities to perform, and your own skills. So there's often also a very self-blaming dimension there. You think like, oh, I lacked resilience, I lacked willpower, and this has happened to me because I'm not strong enough. And then there is also, just inability to be productive. Like you just can't do anything anymore. And I would say burnout for me, like lighter versions of burnout, is when we spend a lot of time languishing, when we neither work nor rest. And I think for me, that's always the danger zone, when you're like in this gray zone, this no man's land, where you don't allow yourself to rest, but you can't actually work, and you kind of languish. And that's really dangerous because, when we start to feel depleted and exhausted, the most important thing we have to do is to rest. But because we get very anxious about falling behind, resting is precisely what we don't do anymore, and we don't allow ourselves to rest. And that's, that's the kind of paradoxical reaction that pushes people into burnout, because you're like, oh my God, I'm behind with my work, I have to do X, Y, and Z. And then you stop resting, and your ability to work becomes ever smaller because you don't rest anymore. So I think the great danger is to not rest, and not to rest, what you also said, not to rest in a recuperative, restorative way, because if you just doom scroll or just spend your time on social media, that's not restorative.
And the likelihood is, what I find really interesting about all of this stuff is, the likelihood is, I found this with my journey as well, and definitely with some of my clients, we've had these conversations in private, that obviously when you're not feeling your best, you're probably Googling things like, why can't I focus at work? Or sleep tips, or why can't I stop feeling so sad, or whatever, right? So you're starting to Google these kind of topics, and then what happens is your algorithm will start to go, oh, this person's interested in these topics, so they're going to start serving you content that's based on those kind of topics. And maybe the people that you start following are going to either be like these kind of motivational speakers, or on the flip side, other people who also suffer with depression, suffer with this problem. And so that narrative is being ingrained ever more, because then suddenly, where you're worried about yourself, you start to privately like Google, because that's what we all do, right? God knows what Google knows, the secret fears that are going on in my brain, the stuff that we don't want to ask anyone else, we ask Google, but then that sets our algorithm. And so then suddenly you're getting served more and more content saying, you're burnt out, you're exhausted, this is wrong with you. Or on the flip side, because I remember this happening to me for a while, then you've got all these people that are like, you just need to get up and make your bed, and it's a choice, and you've got, and all of this kind of stuff. And it's like, oh my God, so that compounds ever more. There's something wrong with me. I'm doing something wrong. Like, why can't I just get out of bed in the morning like a normal person? Why can't I be sprightly and full of energy like all these people? And then what you find out is, like I was listening to Stephen, I think it was on Diary of a CEO. It might have been, can't remember if it was actually, I might have misquoted that. But basically there's this guy called the Liver King. I don't know if you've seen his stuff in America. He does this whole stuff about, he has various tenements that he follows, and he basically never wears a shirt. This is how you'll know who he is. If you see a guy who doesn't wear a shirt, this is the Liver King. And he's like, ripped, like insanely kind of like hench dude. And he swears that it's down to these living more like a caveman, basically. So he sleeps on a board. He doesn't have a mattress. He makes sure he gets daylight on his eyes first thing in the morning, and like tries to watch a sunset at night, I think is one of them. Sorry to the listeners, because you know that I just go on these random tangents, and I should probably research this stuff before I just start talking about it without any proper background. But anyway, this guy, and he eats liver, that's part of the thing. And he's called the Liver King, and he thinks liver is just this the most nutritional food, and this is how he's got this insane body, even though he's like 40 years old. Anyway, it's just come out, he's on steroids.
Okay.
Right. And he's historically denied, that he's used steroids or whatever. And maybe because it was like a leaked email, maybe it's someone having a go at him, and maybe that's not true. But I do think that when you are looking at all these people and they're saying, I'm a motivational person and I do this and I do that, the amount of people that have been debunked that morning routine they're talking about, they don't do it every day. That this and that they're saying, this is how to be like this 9 times out of 10. It's not just that one thing. Yeah. It's all these other things, that don't. So there's often context gets lost, and then we just blame ourselves. So for people that are feeling burnt out, because all of that stuff that you were sharing just then, I thought that is 100% my journey. Every single thing. And you're so hard on yourself because you just feel like, why, for me especially, there was just this like, why can't I just, and then pretty much everything in my life, why can't I just keep on top of my washing? Why can't I just be more energetic? Why can't I just finish this project at work? Why can't I just be, it was always like there was something that I just couldn't quite get to this space. Yeah. If people are starting to notice that about themselves, what are good ways of, allowing yourself to rest? Because I know we've sort of talked about rest being so important. And with long COVID, it's actually, I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny. It's actually been really serious. But I'm laughing because I went to this hospital appointment to see a physio about long COVID. And she said, okay, are you resting? Are you doing? I said, yeah, I'm sleeping loads. I'm really resting. And she said, well, tell me a typical day. And for me, I was doing like nothing comparative, because I'm usually very, very busy. So for me, it felt like I'm probably operating like 10 or 20% of my normal daily life. What are you doing? I said, I'll get up in the morning and then I try and either do a meditation or some kind of journaling or something. And then I'll try and go for a walk, and then I'll come back and, I'll just have a coffee or whatever. And then I might do a couple of emails, and then, I'll try and go for a walk at lunchtime, and then I'll try and do a walk in the evening. I'm trying to get my 10,000 steps in, even though I can't properly exercise, blah, blah, blah. And I was telling her all this stuff, and she just started laughing, and she was like, I thought you said you were doing nothing. And I was like, well, I am doing nothing, like comparative. And she was like, no, you need to do nothing. Like, you need to lay on your couch and stare at the ceiling. Nothing. And when I started doing that, I actually started getting better. Okay. But it's my impression of what was rest and nothing, and her impression of what was rest and nothing were two completely different visions. Both true in one sense, because for me that was true. I was doing basically nothing comparative. So I think a lot of people that have burnout, they're generally these perfectionists, people that are overachievers, and so they might be thinking, well, I am resting or I am slowing down, and maybe they're not. So what are the ways that they can get good quality rest?
Yeah, it's a funny story, and I definitely have to look up the Liver King. But
look him up. Honestly,
I will look him up. But I would say that also the point you made before about the personal blame narrative, that also destroys rest, doesn't it? If you even if you're doing nothing, but if you have a very harsh inner voice, if you have like a self-incriminating, self-flagellating inner critic who is constantly kind of bombarding you with accusations even while you're trying to rest, your rest will not be restful. That's why I think the personal blame narrative when it comes to burnout is really toxic and really dangerous. And you mentioned all these gurus who make it worse by saying, like, I found the recipe, you just have to follow me and you'll be fine. That never works like that, because we're all very unique and very different beings. And, what restores one person doesn't necessarily restore another person. So I think it's also, in my work, with my clients, I also try to really draw attention to what is systemic and what is coming from the outside, and for which they shouldn't take the blame, because a lot of people do work in toxic working environments, and they do have, socioeconomic stressors in their lives that are not their fault. And they have bad bosses, and they have shitty co-workers who make their lives hell. And that can all massively contribute to burnout. And they don't feel appreciated at work. They don't feel valued. They have a workload that is too high, deadlines that are too tight. And that's all not our fault. So often I think my work with clients is about disentangling what they should take responsibility for and what they shouldn't take responsibility for. And because if you look at the burnout research, it's like a massive amount of the stuff that makes us burned out is actually environmental. It's coming from the outside. And yes, we can build up our resilience. Yes, we can police our boundaries and so on, but only to a certain extent. There's also systemic stuff that can make us ill. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because people take the blame, and that blame culture makes people feel bad. And that also means they can't rest, because if you have that horrible voice in your head that keeps saying, it's your fault, why can't you do this? Why do you lack the willpower and the discipline? That's not restful, right? So I think kind of being sensible about what you can and cannot control, and what is and what isn't in your area of responsibility is really, really important. And then I think, when it comes to resting, what gives us joy and what makes us feel alive is really, really unique. And there's no kind of formula that fits all. In my work with my clients, I try to get them to reconnect what gave them joy in the past, because that's another thing we lose sight of. When we're burned out, like, our lives literally turn gray, and we don't do any of the things that make us feel alive and that give us pleasure. And that, that might be playing the piano, or it might be running a marathon, or it might be getting a pet. It might be, whatever. And resting doesn't mean doing nothing. I'm intrigued that, your physiotherapist recommended doing nothing at all, because I think there's a lot of stuff that can be restful, and it doesn't mean that we have to lie on the couch and do nothing. For me, rest is also what gives us energy. And that can be, resting, especially if we're like super active. But it can also be doing something that is just restorative, that gives us energy. And then it very much depends on what gives you energy, and it's so unique and different. And I think people it takes a lot of work to find out what that actually is. What is restful for you?
And what feels good, because I talk a lot about this thing. I actually learned from a good friend of mine, Carla, who's a doctor, and we were doing a workshop together, and she taught this one thing, which it just, when you learn something and you just have a penny drop moment and you go, oh my God, that is so clear what was happening. And she shares about this emotional home, and how you've got these various different chemicals that basically create your kind of chemical makeup of your emotions. And so I teach this a lot to my clients, because I think it's really helpful. If you're constantly in kind of chronic stress, you're going to be living in the room of your house that basically has these two chemicals, which are, everybody sort of knows about now, adrenaline and cortisol. And adrenaline is high energy, cortisol doesn't feel very pleasant. But what I didn't know is a lot of these chemicals and hormones kind of work a little bit like on a seesaw. So the more you have of one, the less you have of the other, because they kind of need to be in balance. So, they kind of move like consistently throughout the day or the weeks, the months, different cycles, depending what's happening. And for a lot of people, and this was definitely my experience, you're super stressed or anxious or angry, rage, all of these high energy emotions that feel like crap. And then the adrenaline will burn off, because eventually it will. So then you create acetylcholine, which I never pronounce right. So any doctors listening, I'm sorry, I know I butcher that word every time. But basically that's low energy. So it's the opposite to adrenaline. But you've still got the cortisol. So then what happens? We start to feel apathetic, sad, really low energy, but we feel like crap. And for most people, they just bounce between these two things, because you've got all this stress and the adrenaline's running and you're like, and then crash. And then the stress comes again. So we go back up and down, back up and down. And what that does is your body starts to get used to it. And you're not creating the other chemicals which are on the other side. So you might still have adrenaline and acetylcholine on that balance. But when you've got high energy, but it feels good, passion, joy, excitement, like adrenaline junkies who jump out of planes or like go snowboarding or whatever, right? They love to be in the opposite side to stress. It's like, we have oxytocin, DHEA, all of these more positive, dopamine, serotonin. They're the opposite to cortisol. But the problem is moving diagonally across this is quite difficult. So to then relax, if you're in the top quadrant where you've got, adrenaline and cortisol, to relax, properly relax and feel peaceful, to feel in love, to feel super calm, to feel like, everything's good in the world. You need acetylcholine, dopamine, oxytocin, DHEA, right? So you've got to swap all your chemicals. So it's actually really difficult, and it can start to feel quite alien. So for a lot of people that have been under chronic stress for a really long time, saying to them, just relax, it's like it actually feels like your body's resisting the relaxation, because it's like, hey, bitch, where's my adrenaline? I'm used to this. And so you sort of create these chaotic environments sometimes subconsciously to get your adrenaline. And then you're like, oh, thank God, I'm back to what I know. And so for people that are maybe struggling to rest, are there things that they can do that can help them to get into that state and to allow, because joy would also be in the opposite side. So if we're trying to connect with relaxation, peacefulness, joy, what are some good, I guess, strategies for people to be able to lean into that?
Yeah, as you say, it's really difficult to remember what these strategies are when you've been in that other state for such a long time. Then you just forget about how being in the other state feels. You forget what gets you there. And you might even find it a bit threatening because it's not what you're used to. And although the state you are becoming used to is unpleasant, it's the devil, right? So you might even, as you say, be creating unconsciously, like continuing to be in that state. I think what, there are some, it's a cliche, but I think, physical exercise, good sleep, good nutrition is kind of the basis.
Excuse me.
Bless you. It's the basis for the physical side of well-being. And a lot of people who are burned out don't have the energy to take care of the physical body in that way. And then I think I think the key though is to develop kinder self-narratives, because even if you take a bubble bath, even if you try to meditate, even if you use scented candles or go for walks in nature, if you have a really harsh inner voice, you won't be able to enjoy these experiences. They won't be restful. So for me, I think when it comes to burnout, it's very important to look at the deeper narratives, the deeper self-beliefs, and also the ways in which our identity has become entangled with work, and to it's a longer process, but it's a process of disentangling and discovering that we are not our work. And then I think we can enjoy whatever gives us rest again. And I think ultimately for me, the aim is to create a more restful inner state, because
Yes.
often burned out people have really negative self-talk in their heads, and it doesn't really matter what they try and do to rest, because if you have that voice, you won't rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting. I know that we've spoke about this in our last conversation around the kind of like small incremental steps as well. And I think for me, when I was burnt out, I was so desperate to get back to who I was that I didn't, I just wanted to be back to normal in inverted commas, that I didn't realize that back to normal was what was making me sick.
Yeah.
And I still think now, if I hadn't implemented what I now sort of, call my happy habits, if you like, I will get sick. It happens. Like I notice it. If I don't, I don't really have a disciplined morning routine or evening routine. I have things that I know that I need to do super regularly. But I make sure I supplement. I look at my nutrition quite closely. I'm not the best at it, but I know that certain things, if I eat too much of that certain thing, it makes me feel depressed, or it brings up these narratives in my mind. It's one of the reasons I, barely drink alcohol, because when I drink alcohol, I notice my little inner critic gets very, very loud and much harder to control. I don't know why specifically that is, but that's what happens for me. I have to meditate. I have to get out in nature regularly. I have to watch my sleep. There's all these different things that now that I do. But at the beginning, I tried to do all of those things all at the same time. And then when I couldn't, because it was like a personality overhaul and like for somebody that, just pressed snooze 15 times in the morning, dragged herself out of bed, rushed to get to work, sat at her desk all day, grabbed whatever happened to be nearby for lunch, didn't really think about, drank a lot of alcohol, all those kinds of things. Those changes that I was trying to implement were massively different. And so what's your take on that kind of incremental change?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good point, because I think when we're burned out, we also have to accept that it will take a while to get better. It's a serious crisis, and you can't just, push a magic button or swallow a golden pill and work as you used to. So I think, first of all, seeing the crisis as what it is. It's a crisis. It's a moment of breakdown. And it means that you have to change the way you worked. Some people have to change careers. That's incredibly threatening as a thought. If you have worked all your life towards your dream career and suddenly you find yourself unable to do it anymore, that's massive. That's it's a
especially
major...
when it's linked with identity.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am a lawyer, or I am I work as a lawyer, or I work as it's I am. And it's very difficult to untangle that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we need to do is like be incredibly gentle with ourselves and incredibly patient, and also accept that that change will come in the tiniest of steps. And the Japanese have a lovely concept, which I find is really useful for burnout recovery as well. It's Kaizen. And Kaizen is the art of very slow, tiny, incremental change. And it's useful because our system doesn't go into blocking and, this is too much, I can't cope with this, I'm going to reject this change mode. Because the changes are so gradual that our tendency to stay in a given state won't be activated, we won't be too alarmed about small changes. So I would say, tiny, small, incremental changes, what you describe as your happy habits, is a beautiful example of that you just gradually build better, more sustainable habits and find out what is good for you. And you do it so slowly that you're your body won't be too alarmed and
Yeah.
won't just say that's too much, I'm overwhelmed, I'm frightened of all of these changes. So it could be, introducing small things, one a week, and very, very, very slowly, trying to rediscover, like a sense of connection and calm.
Yeah.
And also finding out what makes your body feel good, and then what feeds your soul.
Yeah. It's true, isn't it? Because it's like, if you wanted to be somebody that, I don't know, I've always wanted to be one of those people who gets up at 5 a.m. It's not going to happen. I did it once for 30 days. It nearly killed me. I'm just not. I've got to just deal with it. I'm not a morning person. I'll just try things, and But somebody said to me, do you know what? I bet you could do it if you got up 5 minutes earlier every week over a year.
Yeah.
Because they were like, what time do you normally get up? And I was like, oh, I don't know. Because I'm quite a night owl, so getting to bed for me is quite tricky. So I was like, I don't know, midnight plus. So I normally get up 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, because sleep's important, And so they were like, yeah, so then if you just took back your bedtime 5 minutes and your 5 minutes from 8 a.m. or whatever over the course of a year, you'd be getting up, and it wouldn't be that, it probably wouldn't feel like such a shock. But because you went from like, okay, I'm just going to do it for 30 days, and it's essentially a 3-hour difference for your body, that's like, a real shock. So I love that idea of small incremental changes, and I massively back it, because I just think I use an analogy a lot with my clients about weeding a garden. And, like if you think of your mind like a garden, and like you say with burnout, my internal narrative used to be horrific. It was so bad. And I say it's a bit like you've gone into this garden, no one's touched it ever. And you've got this machete, and you need to start hacking back, because there's just this overgrown, forest, and you sort of hack some stuff back, and you might start to see, oh, okay, I can see now what the garden looks like. But then you're going to need to get your hands dirty. It's going to be a lot of effort. You've got to pull things out, mow the grass, dig up all the soil, fertilize it all, decide where you're going to put everything. Then you've got to plant all your seeds and everything. And it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of hard work. But then after a while, you're like, it's looking good, and it's okay at that point when the garden's kind of done, and summer is here, and the plants all look great, and the flowers are out, and it's okay to go around and enjoy it and pick your fruit and relax. So you can invite your friends around for a garden party or barbecue and have some fun. But if you don't stay on top of the weeding, and you don't stay on top, and that's your happy habits, right? That's your watching your nutrition, doing a bit of meditation here and there, going to the gym, whatever it is for you, all that stuff that we all know. Like, we all know how to be healthy now. You'd have to be living under a rock, right? Not to have some idea of how to know about nutrition, how to know about sleep, how to know about all these things, because the information's all there on the internet. But if you don't stay on top of it, then your garden is going to just go back exactly how it was. Yeah. And that's where I think these like affirmations and positive thinking and, all these little things that we can do over time help to keep that garden looking nice. It's nicely weeded. Yeah. You're not having to. And if you don't do those little things, then, unfortunately, it's going to be really hard work again, because it's all got overgrown. And so it's about kind of staying on top of everything. And that's what I've definitely found in my journey. It doesn't have to be rigid. You don't have to be out there weeding every day, because sometimes there aren't any weeds to dig up. They haven't grown back yet. But you need to be on top of it to know when they are coming back, so that you can do the work.
Yeah, I love that metaphor, the gardening metaphor, because it's also about cultivating, cultivating good habits, and it, and implied in your metaphor is also that it's ongoing work.
Yes.
Right. But ongoing sustainable work, because once your garden is in good shape, it's about maintaining it. It's not about radical revolution. It's not about total transformation, because that stuff scares us and that stuff costs a lot of energy. And when we burned out, we don't have that energy, right? But I think the kind of gentle, seasonal, cultivating effort, that's something we can all accept and subscribe to. And I think, metaphors matter. The metaphors with which we think about our inner life are really important. And I like the gardening metaphor because it does suggest, it's not a magic bullet. It's a kind of continual, sensible, gentle effort, right?
Absolutely.
And you're taking care of something as well. It's a kind of, a cherishing and nursing, nurturing.
And remembering to enjoy it when it's...
and you can sit in your garden and enjoy it, of course.
That's the thing, I think, because I think, leaning back in and connecting to joy is so important, because when you've been burnt out and you're really, I would say it took me a good 3 years to come back from my burnout properly. That's a long time. And when you're in this like self-development and I've got to heal and I've got to, it can get really like heavy and really like serious. And actually sometimes it's like, play, go and have some fun, enjoy yourself. Like, you did the work, go and have some fun,
Yeah, absolutely, because the lightness goes when we burn out as well, any lightness and joyfulness and, just, when we don't have enough energy, we become very stingy with our energy as well. Like energy is like, we don't have a lot of it, so we have to guard it incredibly carefully. And we don't have any to waste, on joyful, playful things. So we can't be exuberant or kind of, just generous with what we have. It's like, it's this precious limited resource, and we have to be highly strategic about what we put energy into. And I guess the gardening metaphor is so nice also because, like, I really don't like the mind as a computer metaphor. It really annoys me, because it's very much like, we're not machines, and we shouldn't aspire to be machine-like. And we can't just reprogram ourselves, or we can't just rewire or get rid of malware. It doesn't work like that. It really requires careful inner work and contemplation and and a continuous gentle effort, not just like, chuck, you're healed. It doesn't work.
And I use that analogy sometimes with the computer in terms of like reprogramming, because I think you can reprogram your mind and you can rewire, like in terms of neuroplasticity, but similarly it's ongoing. You can't you can do it, but it's like, when I talk about how I rewired my brain, and people then don't want to hear it, because I was like, well, I was practicing my affirmations 8,000 times a day, every day, for months and months and months, and I still practice them every day. Maybe not 8,000 times a day, but at the beginning I did. And people are like, oh my God, look, how long did that take? All day. That's how long it took. All day. It was exhausting and it was boring, and I didn't want to do it, but it worked, because that's how you create new neural pathways. And you can't do it any other way. And it's, that is the hard work. That's your machete bit, I'm conscious of time. I just looked at the time. I could chat to you all day, but I really want to know, what one thing do you wish you'd known about exhaustion before you kind of learn everything that you've learned?
Wow, that's a good question. I think there are a lot of toxic narratives around about work, hustle culture, work and identity having become mixed up. And I think we now need to be really cautious about how we work, and see overworking as much as a danger to our health as is tobacco and not sleeping enough and loneliness. I think toxic working patterns are really, really, really big health risks. And I kind of wish that I think there's a cultural shift happening right now, and people talk about these kind of things a lot, and that's a positive development. I feel like, I wish I'd known that earlier, the dangers of over-identifying with your work, being achievement-driven. I mean, it's always, at some level, I think that's always a way of wanting to earn, respect and acknowledgement and love. Often, I think at a deeper level, our overworking is kind of a way of overcompensating for feeling unloved, and it's not a good way. I think there are better ways. So
it's external validation, isn't it, at the end of the day? So and once we start relying on external sources for validation, that's quite a slippery slope, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and I wish I could make this a 2-hour-long episode. There's so many more things I wanted to ask you.
Talk again.
I know. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Maybe anything I didn't ask? Any nuggets of wisdom that you might have for people listening?
I don't know. I would just say, remember that burnout is very likely not your fault. Like all the research shows that burnout is an occupational issue that has mainly external causes. And I think that shift in narrative is really important, because otherwise we sit there blaming ourselves. And, often, we there's a beautiful metaphor out there about like a canary that flutters into a coal mine, and it's really chirpy and yellow and healthy when it goes into the coal mine. Then it gets really sick and sooty and ashen and ill in the coal mine, and it blames itself. But obviously, it's the coal mine that made the canary sick, not the canary. That
I love that analogy.
Resilience. And I think sometimes it would help us just to shift that blame narrative. Not taking too many individual. Not taking individual responsibility for what sometimes is the coal mines in which we are working.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. What a great place to end. If people want to find out more about your work, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, so they can find me on LinkedIn, and I also have a website. It's www.theexhaustioncoach with hyphens in between.com.
Fantastic.
And I'd love to hear from the exhausted and would be happy to help.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to you guys at home for listening. If you are listening or watching on YouTube, please do click that little subscribe bell. If you are listening on your favourite podcast platform, please do leave us a review. Be honest, but 5 stars. Come on, let's be real. It really does help us to reach more people and for us to be able to continue doing what we do. So thank you so much for being here and listening. I will see you again very soon. Much love.
We hope you've enjoyed listening as much as Rachael enjoys making this podcast. Why not share it with a friend? And if you really love it, drop us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it really helps us reach and inspire more people. Thanks for listening.